And now on to this evening's talk by Erik Blackthorne-O'Barr. So Erik is a doctoral candidate at the Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies Department at Columbia University in New York. He's currently writing his dissertation entitled Persian Letters, Language, Politics and Desire in the Late Ottoman Empire. This examines how the notion of Iranian influence structured the project of Turkish language reform. Before coming to Columbia, he completed a master's degree in Turkish studies at Sabancı University in Istanbul and a bachelor's degree in the Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations Department at the University of Toronto. He's the co-editor of Levantines of the Ottoman World, Communities, Identities and Cultures, and he has work published in a number of other publications. So Erik, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing and please share your presentation. We'll take questions and comments afterwards. If you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, you can do in various ways. Turn your video on, wave your hand, use the Zoom function, or put something in the chat. Erik.
Great, thank you so much. So I will share my screen now. And I believe it should be this one. Okay, is that visible for everyone? Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you so much. Before I begin, I would just like to extend my deep thanks to Craig and Quentin for inviting me here to speak and for all their assistance and accommodations in arranging a date and time for this presentation. And of course, I want to thank the Levantine Heritage Foundation for welcoming me here today. So the talk I'll be giving is entitled A Permanent Danger to All Her Neighbors, Persia and the Cultural Politics of Cholera, which is in part based on my dissertation research, which focuses on the conceptualization of Persian cultural influence within the history of Turkish literary and linguistic modernity, and is in part based on my earlier work on cholera in the Ottoman Empire. And these, at first might seem like very disparate topics. One is really rooted in literary history, linguistic history, and the other demands a kind of epidemiological or social approach. But what I want to argue here today, and I'm just going to be offering a sketch here, it's not like a fully comprehensive program, but it's just kind of my initial research, is that the histories of disease and histories of language in the 19th century Ottoman Empire are intimately bound up with one another. And this was above all true in the second half of the 19th century, when under the influence of Darwinism in biology and comparative philology and linguistics and Romanticism and nationalism and political thought, we see that there's a notion of organism that really, sorry, my window closed here. Let me open that back up again. It's a bit odd. Okay. Let me start that up again. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so we have a notion of organism that comes to constitute a common thread linking together different disciplines. As the Turkish author Ömer Seyfettin will write in 1911, organism, uzviyet, is the world of life, the eternal law of morphology that encompasses everything that exists. And so, in this sense, what appears to us now as the discrete realms of biology, linguistics, and literature appeared in the 19th century as governed by essentially the same principles and interpermeable. And so here we have a very classic diagram of language as a tree that is kind of expanding from roots and is just following from this kind of evolutionary path. This is from August Schleicher, who is one of the kind of preeminent linguists of the 19th century. And this kind of diagram is now very familiar to us, but at the time it was quite a remarkable shift in the way that language was historicized and perceived. And so what we see in this discourse is that language becomes associated with terms like evolving, dying, morphing, degenerating. The Oxford philologist Max Mueller will talk about the diseases of language. And Schleicher, the person who made this graph, will talk about how certain languages, because of their grammar, because of their verbal form, are doomed to go extinct, or they're doomed to have the cultures that host them, to dwindle away in history. So there's this kind of really deep interconnection between language, culture, and this kind of demographic and biological reality. So this presentation will follow a similar linkage between language, culture, disease, and death in the writings of the statesman, poet, journalist, and playwright, kind of all-around Renaissance man, Namık Kemal, who is probably one of the most paradigmatic figures of the Ottoman Turkish politics, culture, literature in the 19th century. But the specific linkage he focuses on, and what I'm going to focus on today, is something that I think is still kind of surprising. In his 1874 text, Bahar-ı Danish, or Introduction to the Spring of Wisdom, the introduction to this text, Namık Kemal laid out a reformist program for Ottoman literature, which he had been developing over the course of about a decade. For Namık Kemal, the great tragedy of Ottoman language and literature was its early exposure to the overpowering influence of Persian, and especially Persianate culture, Persian aesthetics, what he termed Persianate fantasy, hayalat-ı acemane, or Persianate exaggeration, mubalağa acemane. And he wrote in this text that even those Ottoman writers who despised the Persianate style found it impossible to rid themselves of this system. As he wrote, can a single page of Ottoman literature be found that is free from Persian words and compositions, manners, and fantasy? The Persian aesthetic, he argued, provided a dream world of dazzlingly beautiful images against which reality appeared bare and barren. A paradise of, quote, mountain tulips and tattered roses, water lilies like the sky, waists as slim as a hair, snake-like curls, wraith-like necks as long as cypresses, sword-like bows, sword-like brows, arrow eyelashes, and dagger dimples, mustaches like violets and emeralds, and beards like riverside meadows. So these kind of very elaborate poetic imagery that for Namık Kemal is a distraction from the representation of life. So as he concluded, the literature of Iran was among the most corrupt in the world. Now, insofar as his criticism remained framed in terms of fantasy against reality or exaggeration against truth, it was not actually that distinct from Namık Kemal's earlier critiques of Persian literature. We might find similar terms as early as his 1866 article, Some Thoughts Regarding the Literature of the Ottoman Language, which he published in his journal Tasvir-i Efkar. But there is something really new in this 1874 text. As he wrote, quote, the Persian accent has prevailed in our language, and its faults, which are composed of exaggerations, ugly similes, and verbal allusions that are contrary to both nature and to the beauty of language, have become foundational elements of our literature. In this respect, among the writers of the New School, and here he's including himself, whose written works are beloved by the general public, the desire to transfer something from Persian to our language must be regarded as something like an infectious disease. İletisariye. And in this text, Namık Kemal will go on to say that his own opinion is a little bit more nuanced. He admits that Persian literature has these great poetic masterpieces, but that its influence on Ottoman is this kind of disease that has affected the language. In his critique of his former colleague Ziya Pasha's poetic compilation Harabat, which he wrote that same year, Namık Kemal would again describe Persian influence in similarly biologized terms. Quote, it is necessary to admit that our language has been contaminated, telvish etmiş, by Persian, and that all of its defects of intellectual virtue and refinement of sentiment have arisen from Persian imitation. And when we look at the writings of intellectuals and authors who follow in Namık Kemal's wake, we see that this language is taken up. So people like Ahmet Mithat Efendi, Halit Ziya, Halide Edip, Ömer Seyfettin will bring up again and again this kind of notion of Persian influence as this kind of disease or contamination or the sickness of language. Halit Ziya will call it the disease of our era. It's called The Sickness of Our Literature by Ömer Seyfettin and by the literary historian Mehmet Fuat Köprülü. And in Ahmet Mithat's novels, reading Persian will bring two English schoolgirls to the point of death, and simply hearing Persian will cause the inhabitants of Galata to succumb to obsession and moral corruption. And yet I can't find any earlier association between the Persian language and this infectious disease metaphor before Namik Kemal's Bahar Danish, 1874. So where does this notion come from? And I think it would be possible just to say that, okay, we have this generic notion of or language as organism, and that maybe he's just kind of drawing it from this kind of broader cultural understanding of language. But I don't know if that really works here because, firstly, it doesn't really explain why 1874 is the date that it appears. And second, because Namik Kemal's own conception of language doesn't really neatly fit into that kind of biological paradigm. For instance, when he talks about Arabic and the value of Arabic, it's very much enmeshed in an Islamic framework, talking about how Arabic is the language of divine ontology, so it connects meanings between the divine realm and the human realm. So it's very much a much more kind of classically Islamic framework. Whereas here, thinking about language in terms of disease is a much more kind of biological, kind of more 19th century linguistic framework. So why does it appear for Persian and not for Arabic, for instance? And what I want to argue in this presentation today is that there actually is a very consistent body of writing in the Ottoman context, which would have been available to Namik Kemal, and which cast the influence of Iran in precisely the same terms. And this was epidemiological discourse, exemplified most of all by the Gazette Médicale d'Orient, the kind of main journal of the Ottoman health establishment, and the international sanitary conferences, within which both the Ottoman Empire and Iran were active participants. In his famed literary history of the 19th century, the author Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar notes the omnipresent place of tuberculosis in late Ottoman literature. He says it's almost the most important vehicle in the plays, novels, and stories of the period, and it is kind of a reality, a social reality that is abstracted and made aestheticized within Ottoman literature. And what I kind of want to argue here today is that there's a similar translation of a kind of real, embodied, biological reality of disease into the aesthetic realm that takes place in Namik Kemal's thought and then afterwards. And here it's not tuberculosis, but plague and cholera that serve as the essential references. Epidemic cholera was particularly associated with Iran, although Ottoman physicians, like their European counterparts, identified the disease's origins in British-occupied Bengal. Its spread was, and traced its spread through the Indian subcontinent, to Russia, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. Uh, because Iran was a sort of medium through which cholera moved from India to the Ottoman Empire, it kind of gradually acquired a particularly Iranian connotation. And as I'll outline, the debate over whether Iran itself was the reservoir of the disease would become a point of severe contention in the later part of the century. And to be sure, Namik Kemal does not directly reference these debates in the years before Bahar Danesh, although he wrote extensively on cholera and engaged in a spirited literary argument with Mirza Malcolm Khan, who will be the Iranian delegate to the Constantinople Cholera Conference in 1866. But we should remember that most, or at least a great uh, plurality of Ottoman literati in the 19th century were themselves physicians or attended medical school. People like Janab Shahabeddin, Riza Tevfik, Khalid Zia, Ahmed Mithat will be the head of the Quarantine Council. So all these kind of very prominent figures of Ottoman literature who are going to be talking about Persian influence in this kind of very biologized terms themselves were physicians, or they were engaged in medical discourse, or they were, in the case of Ahmed Mithat, actually in charge of the Quarantine Council itself. But more broadly, I would argue, cholera's impact permeated through culture in forms both evident and subtle. It was a symbol able to bear multiple connotations and meanings. In a 1961 article that still remains relevant, Asa Briggs noted that cholera inspired not only sermons but novels and works of art. And for this reason, the study of cholera can be something more than just a study of medical epidemiology, but a really neglected chapter of social history. And in this regard, I think the study of cholera in the Ottoman Empire in terms of its cultural aspects, is something that really is growing, but it's still something that is in its earliest stages. Now we have very excellent studies on Ottoman institutional response to cholera by people like Nuran Yildirim, Mesut Ayar, Michael Christopher Lowe, as well as an excellent study on plague and quarantine by Birsen Bulmush. But in terms of the broader cultural impact of cholera, I think really we're thinking in terms of Palmira Brumit's work in the 1990s and Nuket Varlock's work on epidemiological Orientalism, which I think is a really powerful tool for thinking about the association between disease and particular geographies. But I think if there's one thing I want to bring out in this presentation in regard to that notion of epidemiological Orientalism, is that we can't just kind of think about it in terms of European discourse produces or Orientalism or in the field of epidemiology, and the Ottomans are kind of the recipients of it, right? If we take Orientalism seriously as a form of knowledge, then what we see is that the Ottomans themselves partake of these kind of terms, they partake of this discourse in their own processes of self-definition. So Usama Makdisi famously wrote about Ottoman Orientalism in 2002. And I guess what I want to kind of talk about here is a sort of form of Ottoman epidemiological Orientalism. But again, I think when we think about it in terms of who is actually making this discourse, we're talking about Levantine doctors, Ottoman Turkish intellectuals, the lines between what is European, what is Ottoman become very blurry. Okay. So from its origins during the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, the establishment of a modern Ottoman health system was framed ideologically and geopolitically. Both Birsen Bulmush's book on plague and some forthcoming article by Sharon Mizbani have shown how the foundation of the Ottoman quarantine system in the wake of the first cholera pandemic, which we see here mapped, were not purely sort of medical interventions, but really framed from the start in terms of a shift towards a more interventionist form of governance. And in fact, the institution of quarantine in the Ottoman Empire, which began in 1838, actually took place during a time when the efficacy of quarantine was really under dispute. In fact, the very idea of contagion itself was something that was really being heavily debated, especially within French and British medical discourse, because a disease like cholera is something that you can't actually catch by touching someone. You can't catch by getting coughed on. It can't be spread by blood, right? Without knowing that the medium of it is contaminated water, it's actually quite a confounding disease. And for that reason, the imposition of quarantines in the Ottoman Empire and in the kind of global sanitary system more broadly was quite a controversial one because it seemed to be a very harsh remedy which could not really be justified on medical grounds. So when we think about or the circumstances by which the Ottoman Empire adopted quarantine, we have to understand it as being, in many cases, overdetermined by politics rather than by medicine itself. So when we look at where the first quarantine facilities were constructed, they were actually constructed on the Iranian Ottoman frontier, rather than what we might expect, which would be in the Hejaz near Mecca and Medina, where these kind of flows of pilgrims are coming. And as Isaac Bolanos has noted, cholera broke out in Iran in 1846, 1847, 1851. Almost every couple of years, cholera broke out in Iran. And so, because of that, the Ottoman Empire really began its initial focus in terms of implementing quarantine, really as a means of kind of establishing a hygienic frontier with Iran. And when you think about the kind of institutions that were developing in the Ottoman Empire at that time, things like the Imperial School of Medicine, the Constantinople Board of Health, and the Imperial Society of Medicine, all of these institutions serve to kind of demarcate the Ottoman Empire as belonging to what Valeska Huber has called Fortress Europe, right? This notion that Europe is a kind of epidemiological safe area, and that by having these institutions, by having a quarantine system, the Ottoman Empire is able to be included within this European sphere, whereas Iran becomes pushed outside. And in contrast to the well-developed institutions of the Ottoman state, Iran only established a similar sanitary council in 1867, and that only lasted a few months. So, because of that, there was this kind of very clear propaganda aspect, this clear, very clear ideological aspect in which the Ottomans could say, we have developed a health system, we have developed a very efficacious quarantine system, and Iran has not. And therefore, Europe or the Ottoman Empire should be kind of included in this European sphere, whereas Iran, which was their geopolitical rival, should be kind of excluded from it and should be kind of placed under a sort of sanitary supervision, both by Ottoman and European doctors. And one of the kind of main vehicles for this kind of notion of Ottoman self-definition as European in epidemiology was the Gazette Médicale d'Orient. And from 1863 to 1864, it ran a series of travelogues by a doctor named Coretto, who was a member of the Imperial Society of Medicine, in which he traveled throughout Iran and comparatively analyzed its hygienic state with that of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, from the very first serial, it was clear that Coretto regarded the hygienic conditions of Iran as inseparable from a broader problem of Iranian culture. As he wrote in May 1863, the traveler who is currently visiting Persia can understand how degraded the empire is, how profound its decadence is. While everything around it prospers, Persia remains motionless, stationary, and from being powerful, strong, and feared, it has today become the humble vassal of Europe. And later he calls it the kind of a ruined empire, a tottering state. In the following June issue, he went into further detail. Persia, he wrote, is a land that is almost completely sterile. The soil is infested by burrowing rats and poisonous insects. The air alternates between scorching heat and oppressive malarial humidity. Its winds carry fine dust that cause breathing issues and blindness. Tehran, he wrote, was a toxic city due to the unfortunate influence of its climate, the putrid emanations of its stagnant waters, the poor quality of its drinking waters, as are all waters of Persia, the generally fatal diseases that reign there, fevers, dysentery, etc. All these conditions make Tehran, above all, an extremely unhealthy place. So the idea here is that this traveler coming from the Ottoman lands is kind of entering into this zone of almost complete unhygiene, right? This is a realm where in almost every aspect, the environment, the culture, the city, it is this kind of biological catastrophe. You know, in Iran, he wrote, one searches in vain for a hospital or a hospice. Instead, medicine is delivered by sorcerers, witch doctors, and fools who treat patients with outdated Galenic principles and mix in with superstitions and kill as many patients as they treat. By contrast, he concluded, quote, no one can deny today the progress that Turkey offers us compared to its sister and neighbor, Persia. Constantinople, from the medical point of view, especially, is, compared to Tehran, a center of light. It is a school of medicine whose teaching is entrusted to very distinguished European professors. The school has already provided, in its 25 years of existence, a number of trained doctors to the Ottoman army and to the country. Turkey has a perfectly organized quarantine system, with the help of which it has triumphed over the most formidable scourge of the Orient, the plague. The doctors of this service are found in all parts of the empire, where they propagate the benefits of vaccination and provide medical aid to the populations around them. So again, this idea that the Ottoman Empire has progressed into this realm of hygienic modernity, whereas Iran is kind of this backward state. And what was the cause of this discrepancy? Credo argued that the problem above all was cultural, rooted in what he called a morbid apathy, a fatalism, and a preference for a fantasy and superstition over scientific truth. As he continued, quote, the Persian is too enslaved by his habits to escape it, and this is the principal cause of his inferiority. Without this obstacle, the country might be prosperous, rich, and powerful, for it lacks nothing to march towards progress and to attain it. But above all, it would be necessary for the common man, the great and the rich, to shake off this deadly apathy which annihilates nations and makes them disappear piece by piece from the face of the world. So again, here we have this notion that not only is it kind of rooted in culture, but that Persia is on its way towards extinction because of this kind of lack of care, lack of interest in hygienic reality. In 1864, after apparently receiving criticism from Iranian officials, Credo restated his prior arguments and went even further, attacking Iranians for their ignorance, fanaticism, gullibility, brutality, and poor hygiene. As he wrote, oops, back there. So I'm on a new computer, so it's a little bit awkward. Don't know why it's doing that. Okay. As he wrote, quote, although nothing is more frequent in Persia than bathing establishments, it is hardly possible, I believe, to meet a people dirtier than the Persians. Bathing in particular would become a major point of contradistinction between Ottoman and Iranian hygienic discourse, with the Iranian practice of bathing in still, unchanged water and allowing both sick and healthy to intermingle, receiving particular comment. Ironically, it would be in Istanbul, not Iran, that Quetta would fall victim to the catastrophic cholera of 1865. And here we have a map of that cholera outbreak. And here, this outbreak would be caused by the Ottomans relaxing their quarantine regime to allow Ismail of Egypt to enter into the city, and thus allowing the disease to spread from Alexandria to Istanbul. Nevertheless, in the wake of the 1865 outbreak, which was known as the Great Cholera, and sorry for the somewhat grisly picture, uh, Iran would remain the kind of main focus of hygienic discourse in the Ottoman Empire. Above all, the specter of the Iranian pilgrims to Karbala, Najaf, and the other cities like Aleppo, where Iranians were blamed for bringing cholera in August of that same year. But the most contentious aspect of this pilgrimage was the so-called corpse traffic, which has been studied in some detail by Firuze Kashani Sabet and Sabri Atesh. For centuries, the corpses of devout Iranian Shiites had been brought to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, on the Ottoman side of the border, for burial. As Sabri Atesh has described, this corpse traffic represented a significant driver of commercial activity in these cities, and customs duties on the thousands of corpses moved across the border each year comprise a significant portion of provincial revenues. Even the modernizing administration of Mithat Pasha in Baghdad had been content to systematize and bureaucratize this practice rather than suppress it. In 1871, he signed a treaty with his Iranian counterpart, ensuring only that, quote, moist corpses would not be allowed to cross the border. As early as 1860, however, the Gazette Médicale Royale had called for a ban on this trade, arguing that, quote, most of these corpses arrive naturally in putrefaction, despite the custom the Persians have of filling the coffins with quinces, cloves, cinnamon, camphor, shawls, and other contraband objects in order to avoid paying customs. In 1865, the Gazette would again describe Iranian pilgrims as, quote, leaving disease everywhere in their path, because they brought with them a fairly large number of corpses embalmed with more or less care. By 1867, the language of the Gazette had grown more florid. As it wrote, quote, but the worst is that the corpses of those who die on the way are added to the old debris in such a way that as each caravan approaches its destination, it becomes more and more enriched by putrefying corpses, and that even if the mortality rate has already been considerable, which is not rare, these caravans come to resemble walking charnel houses, spreading fetid exhalations far and wide. So this kind of really kind of grisly image of this kind of caravan of corpses comes to form a really central motif of hygienic discourse in this period. At the same time, it was acknowledged that among these pilgrims, unlike the pilgrims who were going for Hajj to Mecca, there were no actually recorded cholera outbreaks among them. And so the Gazette argued instead that rather than these corpses themselves carrying cholera, it was the miasmas that they exuded that would bring about cholera in otherwise unaffected populations. In 1868, Dr. Zanaro, who had written the official post-mortem on the 1865 cholera outbreak, wrote on the corpse trade in similar terms. He wrote, Persia sends its corpses belonging to both noble and rich families in all degrees of putrefaction to the sacred cemeteries of Karbala and Najaf. From this account, one can easily imagine how polluted the atmosphere must be, especially in the summer season, in this country where embalming procedures are unknown. Wherever this cadaverous matter passes, the putrid exhalation spreads even to such considerable distances that the inhabitants are often obliged to fumigate or flee in order to breathe clean air. I have said that these human remains are travel in all degrees of putrefaction because, depending on their origins, 10, 15, 20, or 30 days are spent before arriving at the sacred places of burial. This gives an idea, although very incomplete, of these sources of unheard of infections, contrary not only to the preservation of humanity, but also to the spirit of Islam. And I want to kind of stay on that last remark because I think it's a bit curious, right? Like, why is it medically necessary to say that this practice is against Islam? In what way is the Naro qualified to say this? But what interests me is really the way that this kind of movement from an unhygienic practice to a broader cultural problem in the same way that we saw in the travelogue earlier. In this case, that of Shi'ism. By the following year, when the young Osman Hamdi Bey will arrive in Iraq as part of Midhat Pasha's retinue, it will now become Shi'ism itself that, he wrote, is a very contagious disease, knowingly spread by Iranian mullahs, and which contaminate the subjects of this model province and threw Ottoman efforts into chaos. In the aforementioned article, Zanero declared that although Iran contains, quote, a spark, a rudiment of civilization, ignorance, fanaticism, and barbarism dominate the people. And he talks again in great detail about the aspects of the baths, the water. He says, quote, the sewers open up into public streets like small rivers, excrement flows freely, the waters are polluted, and then people drink them up. The public baths are accessible to the masses, and in these baths, both healthy people, syphilitics, lepers, all mixed together. The waters aren't changed for 2, 3, or 4 months. There are piles of dead animals, piles of filth, manure in the streets, and constant fetid odors. So again, his images of Iran are just kind of very visceral images of kind of disgust. And also in Hamdi Bey will write similarly. He'll write to his father, for instance, that he has no idea what a Persian is because Persia has not entered into the path of civilization. And so there's kind of notion that the hygienic aspects that are seen can be used as a yardstick for measuring the comparative aspects of Ottoman civilization versus Iranian civilization. And in 1930, Freud is going to joke that soap is the yardstick of civilization. And I think we see that already in 1860s. But it was at the 1866 Istanbul Sanitary Conference, which I'll go here, which was held at the Galatasaray Lycée, that Iranian delegates could first come face to face with their Ottoman counterparts and dispute their increasingly harsh characterization. Iran sent 2 official delegates, the reformist intellectual and statesman Mirza Malcolm Khan, and the Iranian delegate to the Constantinople Board of Health, Sawas Effendi. Additionally, Jacob Edward Pollack, who was a professor at the Dar al-Funun in Tehran, served nominally as the Austro-Hungarian delegate, but frequently intervened in discussions on Iran's behalf. The Ottomans were represented by Bartolesi Effendi, who was the Inspector General of the Ottoman Quarantine Board, and Salih Effendi, who was the director of the Imperial Medical School, as well as figures like Edward Dalzell Dixon, who was a Maltese-born British member of the Constantinople Board of Health, who again, although he was theoretically the British delegate, also very frequently intervened on behalf of the Ottomans in that conference. And both Valeska Huber and Amir Arsalan Afkhami have written extensively on this conference and the kind of deeply politicized aspect of the medical debates that took place there. As Valeska Huber notes, given that the British refused to countenance sanitary interference in their own governance, the most that the conference could do was to pressure the Ottomans and Iranians to act as a barrier to the flow of cholera from where it was accepted to be endemic in India. In this context, what was at stake for both parties was inclusion within the European sanitary system and the prevention of mandatory quarantines, which would cripple trade relations with Europe. And here Iran was at a significant disadvantage. The proposal put forth by proposal put forth that Iran too be regarded as an endemic source of cholera, provoked fierce protest on the part of Polak and Malcolm, who regarded it as an Ottoman invasion of Iranian sovereignty. Malcolm, somewhat slyly, appealed to the European fascination of Persia by arguing that, quote, how could one admit that so many different authors who have lived in Persia for years could have ignored or passed over in silence an event as serious as the birth and spread of cholera in Persia? Will it be said that they were incompetent? Such an admission of ignorance on the conference's part would compromise it in the eyes of Europe, which knows Persia perfectly well, much better than it knows any other countries. Persia is a government that has always been eager to take all measures and make all sacrifices that the interests of public health deem advisable. If, therefore, the Persian delegates find themselves compelled to rise up against such accusations, it is mainly to prevent the admission of such a great ignorance from persisting in the work of the conference. And Sawast Effendi then added to this that cholera came just as much from the Ottoman Empire to Iran than the other way around, and this proved to be too much for the Ottoman delegates, who again brought up the Iranian pilgrimages to Iraq and the specter of the corpse trade. Both Dixon and the French delegate, Favell, added to this that to place Iran on the same footing as the Ottoman Empire or Europe was unacceptable, and that given the frequency of cholera in Iran, there was little practical difference between endemicity and epidemic. In the end, the resolution was defeated by one vote. Instead, a separate addendum was added, noting Iran's particular role in the spread of cholera and the need for an Ottoman-style health administration, but leaving the question of its endemic character in Iran up for debate. Nevertheless, within Ottoman medical discourse, Ottoman physicians essentially adopted the view that cholera was endemic to Iran, regardless. So in 1872, following a brief outbreak of cholera in Istanbul the preceding fall, Zanaro again blamed, quote, the dreadful scourge which since the general invasion of 1865 has reigned in Persia, sometimes in sporadic form, sometimes in epidemic form. In 1872, Bartoletti Effendi would also write similarly. He would say that cholera was, uh, the endemicity of cholera was no longer a subject of doubt in Persia. And this was following the kind of Great Famine of 1870, 1871, in which, again, Iran was very much a figure of this kind of catastrophe within Ottoman press and Ottoman discourse. But in May of the following year, um, there would be a kind of further debate between Bartoletti Effendi and Folozan, who was the kind of court physician of the court of Nasruddin Shah in Iran. And this was over whether Bartoletti's claim that that cholera was endemic to Iran was in fact accurate. So here we have Folozan in the middle here, kind of depicted in a very kind of elegant miniature painting. And then Bartoletti on the left, and then Dixon, who was supporting Bartoletti's claims on the right. So in May of 1872, Folozan would write directly to the Gazette to dispute Bartoletti's claims, expressing his disdain for a journal that, quote, I would not have to deal with if it had not served as the basis for a diplomatic correspondence between France, Russia, England, Turkey, and Persia. Folozan argued not only that Bartoletti had mistaken the lingering effects of famine for epidemic disease, but that he had spread, quote, fake news, supplied by a disgruntled British telegraph operator, and implied that he had fabricated other evidence. This debate between Folozan and Bartoletti would spill over into the 1874 Vienna Sanitary Conference, where again the question of corpse traffic was brought to the table. Bartoletti, who attended as the Ottoman delegate, attacked both Polak, Iran's delegate, and Folozan by proxy, declaring that the Ottoman diseases all had their origin in the importation of Iranian corpses. He concluded, quote, thus, despite its promises and commitments, Persia, without medical services, without a health council, and moreover, often grappling with cholera and other epidemics, is a permanent danger to all its neighbors and to all of Europe. So it's in this respect that I want to kind of bring it back to my earlier usage of epidemiological Orientalism, it's a hard word to say, and uh, and the notion that we can kind of divide it along kind of European or Ottoman or Iranian lines. And I think what we see here is that these physicians, of course, are Levantine physicians in across both Istanbul and Tehran, but they are zealous advocates of their respective states, right? Folozan is a very committed defender of Iranian interests. Bartoletti is a committed defender of Ottoman interests. And so I think, and of course, in the case of Dixon and the case of Fauvel, I mean, these are delegates who are theoretically the British or, French or Austro-Hungarian delegates. But again, they're intervening on behalf of their respective states, right? On behalf of the Ottoman Empire, on behalf of Iran. Of course, this notion that Persia is a danger to its neighbors and to Europe kind of shows that the central guiding principle was the defense of European sanitary integrity. At the same time, I think to regard this as being kind of Orientalism that takes place by Europeans with the Ottoman Empire or Iran as its objects, I think misses out on these kind of subtleties between these different physicians, right? What we have here is actually a kind of remarkable formulation that is, I think, part of Ottoman self-fashioning, right? It's part of both the way that the Ottomans are defining themselves as a sanitary society, right? And I think that in the kind of way that we see Iran then kind of depicted as this kind of sanitary other, I think this can be represented as a form of epidemiological Orientalism that isn't broken down on kind of European Ottoman basis, but really has a more kind of internal ideological function within the Ottoman Empire. And I think it's in that respect that it's going to filter into the kind of language that we see in Namik Kemal. In the case of Iran, there was a kind of very strongly defensive reaction. So Folazan in the middle here, who ran an Iran sanitary administration for most of the 19th century, or most of Nasruddin Shah's reign at least, became actually a stark voice against the efficacy of quarantine and maintained, well into the 1890s, that cholera first arose in Western Europe. Others reacted in the opposite manner, by performing hygienic practices to an extreme degree. So in the court memoirs of Abdullah Mustafi, who is a figure very close to the Shah, he noted a wave of what he called a plutomania among educated Iranians at the time, who considered everything unclean and full of germs and responded by obsessively washing their hands and clothes, avoiding public baths, eating only in the home, and sterilizing their homes with carbolic acid. Another reaction among Iranians was to accept the terms of Ottoman discourse and use it as a means of social critique. So in Zain al-Abidin Maragai's fictional travelogue, the travel diary of Ibrahim Bey, which was composed in 1902 in Persian and translated to Turkish in 1911, it actually depicts an Iranian resident of Istanbul who compares, again, Iran with Istanbul in terms of their hygienic qualities. Unlike Istanbul, he writes, where government physicians go from street to street and quarter to quarter, door to door, and inoculate the public against disease. Within this travelogue, Iran is a place where sickness festers and contagion is everywhere. Ibrahim Bey visits a public bath in Iran, and he too is disgusted by the pool of stinking water, which had been exposed to the filth of numerous creatures and had become an origin, oh, okay, and had become the origin of every kind of contagious disease. Having come from Istanbul, where water is, quote, completely clear and sparkling, he refuses to enter another public bath in Iran for the rest of his journey. So ultimately, Ibrahim declares what Iran needs is a total reform. It needs its own tanzimat. And so this kind of internal critique then actually adopts the terms of Ottoman sanitary discourse as a means of kind of producing political change in Iran. And then again, this filters back into Ottoman discourse. So when the Ottoman official Ubaydullah Effendi was sent to Iran in World War One, in order to kind of get up to speed on Iran, he reads the travel diary of Ibrahim Bey, right? So he can use as this fictional travelogue then as his guidebook towards Iran. So again, we see the kind of terms of Ottoman discourse moving from the, Gazette Médicale to Iranian literature and then back into Ottoman literature. And actually, when we look at Ottoman travelogues of the period, we find that these similar images appear again and again. Um, so, for example, Suleiman Shukru Kharchanzadeh goes to Iran in 1907. And for him, Iran, again, is kind of all-out assault on the senses. So he writes that he could not breathe the air because it was so full of opium smoke. He tries to clean himself at a bathhouse, but he finds that the quote microbe-infested water is filled with cigarette butts, matchsticks, snot, spit, clippings of hair. Water is a particular concern, so he writes that there is no river in the Ottoman Empire, no lake in Switzerland, and no snake in the Sahara Desert as terrifying as an infected well in Iran. He notes that even natural streams are, quote, clogged by dog bones and the bodies of drowned pups, which turn the stomachs of those who see them. And we see this again and again. So in 1910, the journalist Jamil Said Bey will similarly write his disgust at the fountains and bathwaters of Iran and propose that this was the cause of its demographic issues. A similar description of a, quote, unbelievably disgusting bathhouse in Mashhad can be found in Mehmet Fazl's 1910 travelogue, where he goes to Afghanistan. Uh, and what's really interesting, I think, is that we see again how in these travelogues there is actually a movement towards um, looking at Iranian culture through that hygienic lens. So, for instance, Mehmet Fazl will write that compared to the Afghans, who are primitive but the brothers of the Turks, the Iranians are savages because they are fanatics because, again, they have no knowledge of hygiene. Ultimately, for Suleiman Shukru, the cause of this catastrophe was none other than the Persian addiction to literature. This nation, he declared, which gives no importance to anything other than poetry, can hardly hold the government accountable. Uh, so here we have the kind of interesting thing where it's moving back into language, that's moving back into literature. And actually, what is kind of remarkable in Suleiman Shukru's travelogue is that as he prepares to leave Iran, this kind of sense of disgust then filters back into his notion of language. So he writes at the end of his travelogue as he's leaving the country that he sees the need to extract all Persian influence from Turkish. In a footnote, he writes, "With the purification of our language, one can solve all the problems and discord which afflict the Ottoman state and free both Turkish language and culture from Iran's consumptive Yaltan effects." So there's a kind of strange logic where in the abstract, you would say, well, why does the sanitary situation of Iran demand a purging of Ottoman Turkish from Persianate words? But I think when you put that notion in the context of all these things that have happened before it, from Namek Kemal in 1974 to Suleiman Shukru writing in 1907, you can see how there's a kind of movement going back and forth between language, culture, disease, and then kind of filtering through all these different mediums to work back into the kind of conception of Turkish language. And actually, when you look at even a very later text, so for example, a physician named Fahrettin Shevket goes to Iran in 1923, and we see that actually the terms of Namek Kemal's discourse, Iranian fantasy, exaggeration, these kind of like over-reliance on poetic imagery, is then in his travelogue attributed to the hygienic situation of Iran, where he says that Iran has a climate that is so harsh that it produces these nervous and mental illnesses that kind of constantly stimulate the nerves. And it kind of produces this proclivity to psychosis in Iran that, on the other hand, also gives them their, a quote, extraordinary attention to pleasure and beauty. And he actually kind of rues the idea that with the coming of modern medicine in Iran, that kind of very refined aesthetic sensibility will gradually disappear. So this is kind of, really interesting, rich kind of archive of sources about thinking about the relationship between disease, cholera, language, aesthetics. And here I've really tried to present just a kind of like sketch of some of my research. But I think what I wanted to kind of like really draw on here is that when we finding these kind of new concepts in the articulation of Turkish literary modernity, I think sometimes we kind of just try to cite or look for them within a kind of what we call like the kind of obvious sources, right? Like where they are directly citing from, or where they are, looking at, or where they're engaging with, for instance, young Ottomans are engaging with someone like Gibb, a kind of literary historian in Scotland, and kind of bringing ideas back and forth there. But I think what's lost in that is that we have these other cultural spheres within the Ottoman Empire, such as the Levantine physicians of the Gazette Médicale and the sanitary institutions, that are not kind of hermetically sealed from that culture, right? They're actually deeply engaged with them. The Ottoman literati, who are going to be defining what Turkishness is vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Persian influence, are trained in, medical techniques. They're part of the quarantine council. They're reading about cholera. They're writing about cholera. They're writing about Iran. And I think these ideas filter in. They kind of produce interesting new combinations, such that when we get to someone like Fahrettin Şevket in the 1920s, this kind of very odd notion that it is the kind of lack of hygiene and kind of difficult climate and difficult circumstances of Iran that produces this kind of unique Iranian aesthetic uh, doesn't seem like this kind of a bizarre notion, but kind of has this kind of decades of evidence sort of building up to it within this uh, within this cultural sphere. So I'll leave it there. I know it's a little bit of a scattered presentation, but I hope it was interesting, and I hope I'm looking forward to some interesting comments and questions.
Excellent, Eric. Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting and sort of novel area for us. So if anyone has a question or comment, please indicate by whatever means, turn your video on or put something in the chat. But while you think about that, so maybe if I can sort of ask something, to what extent was were the Tanzimat sort of reforms part of the general background where the Ottomans thought that generally they were more European or more advanced? How influential were they, rather than just the cholera piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this, as I mentioned, there's this kind of notion that the Tanzimat had marked a break in Ottoman political culture, but also in the relationship of the Ottoman state to hygiene, to public health, was very important, right? Where we see, with the Tanzimat, we see the establishment of the quarantine system, public vaccination campaigns. We see the establishment of public hospitals. So the Desmi Alam Hospital we founded a few years later, which is the first kind of hospital for uh, poor Muslims of the city. So we have this kind of full approach to the governance of public health that is associated with this broader project of reform. And what we see is that that gets filtered into Iranian discourse as well. So Malcolm Khan, who will be the delegate to the 1866 conference, will be the figure who introduces the notion of Tanzimat into Iranian discourse, right? So we'll see he'll advocate for an Iranian Tanzimat, right? In the Sehatname Ibrahim Bey, the travel diary of Ibrahim Bey, again, that notion that Iran needs a Tanzimat will be there. And part of that aspect will be that Iran, in its hygienic aspects, in its sanitary aspects, in its health aspects, has fallen behind the Ottoman Empire, and that the Ottomans are moving towards this kind of global civilization. They're moving towards integration into the sanitary system of Europe, whereas Iran is being left in the darkness, essentially.
Hmm.
And so that notion is actually going to be really central.
But to what extent could you attribute some of this this sort of rivalry or criticism to the Sunni Shia divide. Something fairly fundamental where I imagine that would give all sorts of excuses for being derogatory about the other side.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few things that are happening at the same time. So what we have during especially the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II is this kind of movement towards trying to push against Shiism, especially in Iraq, and to kind of establish the Ottoman Empire as being the kind of protector of Sunnism against this kind of Iranian Shiism, Shi'i kind of infiltration. And we saw that in Osman Hamdi Bey's writings from Iraq too. This notion that Shiism itself is this disease that's moving from Iran to the Ottoman provinces. At the same time, I think what's interesting about like Namik Kemal's writings, for instance, is that he really doesn't often talk about Shiism or Sunnism in that way, right? The kind of notion of Persian influence in his work is very centered on its sort of I guess we call it its cultural effects, right? The way that it kind of produces an Ottoman culture that is sort of in the image of itself, right? And in that sense, there's this kind of way in which, on one hand, she practices, so for example, the practices of Muharram, so the kind of the ritual mournings, which become much more prominent, especially in Istanbul during that period. Um, become representative of this kind of Iranian excess and are seen as kind of unhygienic spectacles because you have blood flowing in the streets and all those things and are kind of very much depicted in Ottoman discourse as forms of kind of Shi'i fanaticism. And Namik Kemal will actually talk about this as well. He'll say that like compare the Ottoman theater, which is this elegant, refined institution, to these, bloody spectacles of the Iranians, and you can see how there's this kind of like civilizational difference. Um, but I think the kind of metaphor of contamination disease kind of extends into fields beyond just the kind of Sunni Shi dichotomy. Because I mean, it extends into the Republic as well, right? It extends um, into writers who otherwise don't really are kind of secular writers, but are still talking about it in terms of um, this kind of contamination of Turkish. So that's definitely mixed in together, um,
Yeah.
but it kind of exceeds it in a way.
I suppose the other thing is, would it be fair to say that Ottomans in the 19th century were beginning to see themselves as an industrial nation, a modernizing nation? When you go back to the language and the Persian language being comparatively elaborate, corrupt, sensual, infectious, but all part of a non-industrial, archaic system. Would that also be a cultural sense or sensibility or difference between them?
I think absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think what we see from Namik Kemal onward is this notion that the strength of Turkish is in its kind of direct representation of reality, whereas Persian kind of focuses on pure wordplay and focuses on this purely kind of literary realm. And part of that is this notion that for Namik Kemal, language and literature should be about communication, right? It should be about social benefit, should be about organizing people, should be about establishing kind of civic ethos. And so they do attribute the kind of backwardness of Iran to the way in which the language itself, or its literary aesthetic, seems to privilege the abstraction of language from, from business, from commerce, from everyday communication. Zia Pasha, who is one of Namik Kemal's colleagues, will write similarly that um, one of the faults of Ottoman is that, like, if you want to sign a contract between different provinces of the empire, no one can read an Ottoman, high Ottoman text if you transfer it to like Tunisia, for instance, right? Like it's this language is so elaborate under Persian influence that the kind of basic foundations of governments and commerce and things are blocked. And so we also see that in a way also taken up by Iranians. So Malcolm Khan will similarly write that like uh he'll similarly attack, Persian prose and Persian poetry for being this kind of very elaborate style that gets in the way of modernization, gets in the way of conveying scientific ideas, gets in the way of conveying, you know, commercial ideas, and they'll say that's the reason why, for instance, our commercial affairs have fallen into the hands of the British and Russians, is because we focus instead on literature rather than just saying what we mean. Um, so that's definitely a part of it. And I think we see that a lot in the travelogues too, this notion that, you know, uh, Iran has the resources to be developed, but they're just focusing on poetry rather than um, actually focusing on industry.
So maybe this is an unfair question, but you know, you mentioned that cholera sort of came westwards from India, and you may not have researched this, but is there any indication that there was a similar sort of cultural divide or discourse between, the Persians and the Indians, so, to a similar extent?
Yeah, for sure. I think not to the extent that, um, for example, at the conferences, there will be a very clear push by Iran to say that cholera is only endemic to India, right? Like it does not, it is purely brought either by, pilgrims from India to like the Shi'i holy cities like Mashhad, or by British trade in the Persian Gulf. But it has nothing to do with Persia, like it's purely an Indian phenomenon. Um, in terms of the like kind of broader culture, I haven't seen that so much. I think it's not quite as developed as it is in the Ottoman case. I think partially because again, in the Ottoman case, there were so many things, like so many different cultural spheres where they could talk about the harmful influence of Iran that it kind of gels together in a way. In the sense that when you hear or when you read Iranian kind of nationalist texts of the period, their focus is much more on the influence of Arabic culture rather than Indian culture. And so you do see, for instance, the idea that actually we get cholera from Basra, we get cholera from the Arab cities, right? That it comes across the border this way. But not so much in terms of like critiquing India as much. Yeah.
And by extension, I mean, India, of course, was under the colonial rule of the British.
Mhm.
Ottoman criticism of that, why didn't you stop it in India?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So just let me check. Has anyone else got a question or a comment they'd like to join in? No. So, after all this time, of course, Turkish has lots of words of Persian origin and so on. How much is there a modern hangover of this sort of cultural divide and discourse from the 19th century? Does it exist?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I argue in my research is that it does exist. These traces exist, but they exist in kind of different ways. Um, so to give an example, within, for example, Turkish feminism, for instance, there's a very kind of strong association that moves from the 19th century into the 20th century that the origins of sort of gender tyranny emerge in Zoroastrian Iran. And then because of this dualism and this kind of dualistic religion, and that this kind of influences Ottoman culture and then Turkish culture in that way. And you actually see that as late as the 1960s, 1970s. Afet İnan, who is Ataturk's adopted daughter, has a book where she's called The Emancipation of Turkish Women, where she describes how the whole project of Kemalism had been to remove Zoroastrian influence from the Turkish family, which is again a kind of strange notion because like what does Zoroastrian have to do with? You would think it'd be more about kind of like Islamic influence, but actually talking more about Zoroastrian influence, um, because that's kind of where they're rooting this sort of practice. And you see it in different ways, in ways that are kind of strange. Like uh, there's a sociologist named Ulus Baker who was also talking about film and saying that one of the reasons why he regarded Iranian cinema as being better than Turkish cinema was that for him, Namik Kemal essentially had ruined everything by getting rid of Persian influence. And he says that uh, because Persian language and literature is kind of fantastical, kind of abstract realm that filters into the kind of abstract quality of Iranian cinema, whereas Turkish cinema ended up being kind of plain and kind of pedestrian. I don't agree with that, but like that's a kind of lingering notions that still persist where this kind of rupture from Namik Kemal is seen as this kind of lingering trace within the definition of Iran and Turkey.
I mean, I wonder in let's say the Turkish sort of syllabus in the school system, how is the 19th century taught when viewing relations with Persia, with Iran? Is this touched on, or is it sort of at a much higher level?
I don't think it's even in academia it's not touched on. I mean, I think yeah, it's really only been the past maybe 20 years, 15 years that people started to get really interested in Ottoman Qajar relations rather than Ottoman Safavid relations. So the early modern period have always been interesting to people, but the 19th century was almost unstudied until the past 15 years or so. I mean, that's also because, frankly, Qajar Iran broadly was not very interesting to people until recently. I think people kind of regarded it as this kind of essentially in the terms I described, right, as a decadent, decaying, unhygienic empire. Um, and it was really only a kind of interest in Qajar photography and Qajar painting, Qajar architecture that kind of filtered back into a broader reevaluation of the Qajar Empire. Um, and for that reason, yeah, the study of the 19th century Ottoman-Iranian relations has really been a kind of understudied area.
Hmm,
Um, I think particularly for Ottomanists, but it's also true for Iranian studies as well.
okay, interesting. Um, so now tell us where's your research taking you next?
Yeah, well, so I've been working on this project, which I will be defending 2 weeks. So hopefully I'll be graduating. Yeah, and so this, my research, this is a kind of this presentation is a little bit of a kind of like side detour from a broader project, which isn't focused so much on the disease aspect, but is kind of tracing out the different realms in which Persian was discussed in 19th century Turkish culture. Um, but yeah, I think in the upcoming years, I want to kind of flesh out that project, have it come out as a book, and then also begin to kind of look more hopefully at kind of the Iranian kind of response, looking at how Iranian travelers to the Ottoman Empire kind of built in or adopted these terms and talked about it in different ways. I think it's just trying to kind of also, I think, trace the interactions between the kind of what we associate with like Levantine culture with um, Turkish nationalism, Iranian nationalism in a way that I think has been kind of obscured within the nationalist history.
I mean, that would be certainly interesting to understand better, the involvement, influence, participation of Levantine experts or traveling between the two countries. There was interchange. If you look at, let's say, the carpet trade, but in other areas too, I'm sure, and it's not as well explored or understood, I think. So it would be very interesting to learn more about that when you dig into it. So unless anyone else has got a question or a comment, I'm just looking around. Erik, thank you so much. Really appreciate you giving us your time and your expertise in your talk. Good luck in defending your thesis.
Thank you so much.
And I very much hope that we will see you again before too long with your sort of new material.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today.
And thank you, everybody, and good evening.